Welcome to Informed Sources. I'm News Channel 3's Richard Ransom. It's that time every week when we talk about the week's top stories. But tonight we're going to do things a little differently and devote our entire program to one story that has dominated all others by far. I'm talking, of course, about the scathing report issued by the U.S. Department of Justice Thursday saying there's a pattern of discrimination in Shelby County's juvenile court. The three-year investigation concluded that African-American juveniles were much more likely to be tried as adults, much more likely to be detained by intake officers, and less likely to receive a warning for the same infraction as a white offender. We're going to have the man in charge of juvenile court, Judge Curtis Person, in a moment for an expanded Newsmaker segment. But first, we're going to explore the DOJ's conclusions further with our Informed Sources this week. News Channel 3 commentator Otis Sanford is here as well as program, but not to juvenile justice or the system. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Linda Harris. Ms. Harris is also a former Memphis police officer and is now in private practice specializing on constitutional law issues. All right, you two, let's take this report. Every once in a while there's something that comes along in this community that kind of rips the scab off of maybe some larger issues, and we're going to try and talk about as much of that as we can. But what is your first reaction, Linda? We'll start with you when you saw the report and you read the findings.
Well, I agree with the report issued by the Department of Justice. I think I've heard some of those some of the very complaints that they found have been expressed over the years through various sources. And so if you, I don't know how else to address that other than...
Do you think it's being... Now, Ed Stanton, the U.S. Attorney, made a point of saying that he thinks the juvenile court has been very aggressive in addressing some of these issues even before the report was released, and that the court has been very open with how they've handled this whole situation.
Absolutely. I think that Judge Persons is to be commended for the manner in which he's handled this investigation. There are a number of other jurisdictions that are not so open, and the Department of Justice has to commence a lawsuit against them to obtain the information. But he has been very open, and the report does find that juvenile court has begun to make changes to correct the deficiencies that they found.
Otis, you know, Judge Person is kind of in a position nobody would envy, really. Honestly, you have an older white Republican who's handling a judicial system or court in which 90% of the offenders that go through are African American. In many ways, it's a no-win situation for him.
Well, it really is. But let's be clear. Judge Person is a longtime public servant in this community. He ran for this office because he wanted this office, and he won this office back in 2006. So it's his job, you know, scabs and all. But at the end of the day, Richard, this report is really not about Judge Person. Judge Person is a fine human being, but it is about the issues, the systemic issues that are not just in juvenile court, but throughout the community, in which there tends to be disparate treatment going on that involves, in this case, that involves African-American children as opposed to white children, but also children as a whole in terms of how to really effectively deal with them in the juvenile justice system. And that's what this report is laying out. It's not suing anybody. It's not filing any criminal charges against anybody. It is making some observations that are relevant and need to be paid attention to.
It did conclude there is a problem.
There is a problem. And they also ended with some very glowing remarks, as Linda said, about this, how they are already addressing the issues. And they also stand ready, the Justice Department stands ready to help, to help in any way that they possibly can to make sure that this continues down the right road.
Right.
Linda, what would you like to see done? You've seen the system inside and out, and where do you see the best avenues toward improving any discrimination that might exist?
Well, I think that they are, once again, well underway of bringing about a change at juvenile court. One of the things that struck me as most odd or unusual is that the defenders are part of the juvenile court system. They actually work for the court, and it needs to be independent. So I think that's a good place to start, is to separate those two. Maybe the defenders will go to the state public defender's office as opposed to being a part of juvenile court, so that we can ensure that there's someone there who is advocating for the juveniles, who are entitled to the same constitutional protections as the adults who enter into the system.
What are the larger ramifications of the findings in terms, if I'm a lawyer and I'm representing a juvenile offender and post this report that has come out, do I try to get a case thrown out, or are there any other ramifications that could happen to the offenders themselves or their cases as a result of the findings of this report?
Absolutely. One of the striking things in the report is that they were not being provided with adequate, constitutionally adequate hearings, adjudication hearings, which are the equivalent to a trial in the adult court. These juveniles are, according to the report and according to the Constitution, they're entitled to the same rights as adults, although they're juveniles. That was not happening. So for one instance was that someone received a notice of the formal notice of the charges against them 45 minutes before the adjudication hearing, which would be the equivalent of 45 minutes before your trial in adult court. You're provided with formal notice of charges against you. You cannot adequately defend against those charges. They have a right to be advised of their rights, the rights against self-incrimination, and that was not occurring at juvenile court, and all of those things will now change.
What really stuck out when you read the report, Otis?
Well, again, there were a lot of things that stuck out. First of all, the part of the report that talked about, as Linda said, talked about the lack of notice. Young people would be coming into court, not even aware of what the charges were, not being given written allegations against them, and then they have a hearing and then remand them to a hearing, an adjudicatory hearing, and then they get the charges in writing after that. You don't do that in adult court. So that was really a striking allegation for me. But the overall, and the report spent a lot of time, Richard, talking about the racial disparity. They spent a lot of the 66 pages dealing with that. And you can't ignore some of the findings that they made. Whether anybody agrees with it or disagrees with it, they laid out a case where even taking into account that there are far fewer white juveniles who come to juvenile court, they took that into account and still determined that black offenders were half less likely to get off with a warning. And that, to me, was a little bit disturbing in my mind.
Okay. Any other concluding thoughts you'd like to share, Linda, before we bring Judge Person into the hot seat here?
Well, I have to agree with Otis that was very striking also, that African-American kids were disproportionately represented in the system. And they did take into consideration factors such as the charges, whether or not these kids had any prior convictions, their age, their gender. So all of those.
They were going to school.
Yeah, where they were going to school, and yet they still found statistically, based on the data that they have a duty to report to the Department of Justice, that there's this disparity, and we as a community, I think, have to work together to determine how we can prevent those types of things.
Well, Linda Harris, thank you so much for being part of our panel here tonight. We appreciate that. We appreciate your insight on all of this. When we come back, Otis and I are going to be joined by Judge Person himself. That's right after this.